Hello, horror lovers. If spine-chilling true stories are your nightly ritual, you've come to the right place. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying true stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to me. Don't forget to like this video and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you the best in real horror storytelling. Turn off your lights, look under your bed. Don't listen to this while sitting in the bathroom. And if you have a weak heart, stop this video now. Let's get into the stories. My name is Brian, and I never believed in Bigfoot until one night in the dense forest of Oregon. I was on a camping trip with a few friends, Tom, Jake, and Lisa. We had set up our campsite near a remote lake, surrounded by thick woods and an eerie silence. The first night passed without incident, but as the days went by, the forest seemed to grow darker, and an unsettling feeling settled over us. On the third night, we decided to take a hike into the woods. We followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees, the moonlight barely penetrating the canopy above. Tom had brought along a powerful flashlight, and Lisa carried a small radio, which was playing softly. We walked for a few miles, enjoying the crisp night air and the sounds of the forest. That is until we heard a series of loud, guttural howls that seemed to come from all directions. The howls were unlike anything we had ever heard, deep, resonant, and almost primal. We stopped in our tracks, looking at each other with growing concern. Tom suggested we head back to camp, but as we turned, the howls grew louder and closer. The flashlight beam swept through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Lisa tried to turn off the radio, but the volume seemed to increase on its own. Panic set in as we heard heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, growing closer with each passing second. We hurried back towards camp, but the feeling of being pursued was palpable. The footsteps seemed to follow us, and the howls continued, echoing through the trees. We finally reached the campsite, breathless and terrified. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows around us. We sat in silence, the once comforting crackle of the fire now sounding ominous. The howls continued intermittently throughout the night, and we could hear branches snapping and something large moving around the perimeter of our campsite. None of us slept well, and the next morning, we found strange tracks around our tent. The tracks were large and unusual, with a distinctive wide stride. We followed them for a short distance before deciding to head back to civilization. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and we left the area as quickly as possible. Back in town, we learned that several other campers had reported similar encounters in the same area. The tracks we had found were consistent with descriptions of Bigfoot footprints, and the howls matched reports of unexplained vocalizations in the forest. To this day, I can't explain what we heard or saw that night, but the experience has left me with a deep respect for the unknown. The forest remains a place of mystery and unease, and I've never returned to that area. Sometimes I wonder if what we encountered was truly Bigfoot or something else entirely. The memories of that night linger, a haunting reminder of the unexplained and the terrifying possibilities that lie hidden in the shadows of the forest. My name is Laura, and this is the story of a night that changed everything for me. I was living alone in a modest two-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It was a peaceful place, and I felt safe there, or at least I thought I did. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from the downstairs hallway. I dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps a rodent. However, the scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. My heart started to race, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The noise seemed to be coming from the front door. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. I opened the door slightly and looked outside, but the porch was empty. I checked the locks and made sure everything was secure before heading back to bed. The scratching continued, though, and now it was accompanied by a faint tapping sound. I decided to call the police, but by the time they arrived, the noises had stopped. They checked around the house and found no signs of forced entry or any suspicious activity. They reassured me that it was probably just a false alarm and left. I went to bed, still feeling uneasy. The next morning, I found a strange note on my doorstep. It was handwritten and simply read, "I know what you're hiding." My heart sank as I read the note, and I immediately contacted the police. They took it seriously and increased patrols around the area, but they found no leads. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. My phone would ring, and when I answered, there would be no one on the other end. My car, which was parked in the driveway, would sometimes be left slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. I started feeling paranoid and constantly checked the locks on my doors and windows. One evening, I was home alone, working on some paperwork, when I heard a loud crash from the basement. My heart raced as I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly descended the stairs. The basement was dark and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. I shone my flashlight around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I checked the windows and doors in the basement and found them all secure. I decided to head back upstairs, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed that the front door was slightly open. I hadn't left it like that. I closed the door and locked it, my anxiety escalating. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I decided to set up a camera in the living room, hoping it would capture any unusual activity. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and was horrified to see a figure moving around in my house during the night. The figure was tall and indistinct, wearing dark clothing and a hat that obscured its face. The figure moved around, inspecting various rooms, and seemed to be looking for something. My heart pounded as I saw the figure approach the camera and then disappear from view. I immediately contacted the police and provided them with the footage. They were alarmed and increased their patrols around my neighborhood. They also advised me to stay with friends or family until they could get to the bottom of the situation. I stayed with my sister for a few days, and during that time the police continued their investigation. They discovered that several other homes in the area had experienced similar incidents, with intruders leaving cryptic notes and disappearing without a trace. The investigation led to a local man who had a history of burglary and stalking. He was arrested and charged with several offenses, including breaking and entering and harassment. The authorities found evidence linking him to the incidents at my home. I was relieved that the situation had been resolved, but the experience left me shaken. I returned to my house, but it no longer felt like a safe haven. I had the locks replaced, added security cameras, and made sure to be extra cautious. The incident had taught me the importance of vigilance and the unsettling reality that danger can come from the most unexpected places. The man who had intruded into my life had left a lasting mark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was always a chance that someone was watching from the shadows. My name is Alma, and I was a production assistant on a low-budget horror film set in a remote, old mansion. The mansion was the perfect setting for the film, a grand, decrepit building with a rich history and a reputation for being haunted. We started shooting in the late summer, and from the beginning, there were strange occurrences that seemed to defy explanation. The first incident happened on the second night of filming. We were shooting a scene in the main hallway of the mansion, where the actors were supposed to encounter a ghostly presence. As the cameras rolled, the lights flickered and dimmed, even though we had checked all the connections and power sources. We attributed it to a technical glitch, but the flickering continued intermittently throughout the shoot. Later that night, as we were wrapping up, one of the crew members, Dan, reported hearing footsteps echoing through the empty mansion. He was alone in the building at the time and found nothing when he investigated. We brushed it off as the building settling, but the stories about the mansion's haunted past began to make us uneasy. The following week, things took a more sinister turn. During a night shoot in the basement, a crew member named Sarah experienced something truly chilling. She was alone in the basement, setting up for the next scene, when she felt a cold breeze and saw a shadowy figure move across the wall. The figure seemed to be watching her, and when she turned to confront it, there was nothing there. Sarah was visibly shaken and decided to leave the set early. Her story spread quickly, and the crew's nervousness increased. Despite the growing tension, we continued filming, hoping to get through the project without further issues. But the paranormal activity escalated. One night, as we were filming a particularly intense scene, the sound of disembodied whispers filled the air. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, and they seemed to come from different directions. The actors, already on edge, were visibly disturbed. The sound technician tried to trace the source, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they suddenly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. On another occasion, during a scene set in a darkened room, the props began to move on their own. Chairs shifted, and doors creaked open and closed with no apparent cause. The actors and crew were unnerved, but we managed to complete the scene with minimal disruption. The final straw came during the last week of shooting. We were filming a climactic scene in the attic, a room filled with old, dusty furniture and forgotten relics. As the cameras rolled, a loud crash echoed through the room, and several props were knocked over. The room felt inexplicably colder, and a heavy feeling of dread settled over us. The actors and crew were visibly frightened, and we decided to end the shoot early. The film's director, Michael, who had been skeptical about the mansion's haunted reputation, was now convinced something was amiss. He decided to investigate the mansion's history and discovered that it had a dark past involving tragic events and unexplained disappearances. The mansion had been rumored to be cursed, and the stories seemed to align with our experiences. The film was eventually completed, but the haunting experiences on set left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The mansion was a place of mystery and unease, and the paranormal activities we encountered added an unsettling layer to the production. The film was released, and while it garnered some attention for its eerie atmosphere, the true story behind the shoot was even more chilling. The mansion remained a place of intrigue and fear, and I often wonder if the shadows we encountered were simply the result of a haunted past or something far more malevolent. My name is Alex, and I spent a year living in Briarwood Manor, a house that had a reputation for being haunted. The manor, a large, old Victorian house, had been in my family for generations, but I had never lived there until recently. When I moved in, I was excited to renovate and make the place feel like home. However, from the moment I arrived, I felt a strange presence. The first night was quiet, but by the second night things started to feel off. I heard faint whispers and footsteps in the hallways, even though I was alone. I attributed it to the house settling or my imagination running wild. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances grew more frequent. Doors would open and close on their own, and objects would move inexplicably. I began to feel a constant sense of being watched. I decided to look into the history of the house and discovered that Briarwood Manor had been the site of several tragic events. The most notable was a murder-suicide that occurred in the early 1900s. The family who lived there at the time was found dead under mysterious circumstances, and their spirits were rumored to haunt the manor. Despite this unsettling discovery, I continued with my renovations. One evening, while working in the attic, I found a hidden room behind a false wall. The room was dusty and filled with old furniture, but what caught my eye was an old, ornate mirror. The mirror had an intricate frame and looked out of place in the dusty attic. I decided to clean it and hang it in the hallway, thinking it would add character to the house. That night, the activity in the house intensified. I woke up to the sound of frantic knocking on my bedroom door. When I opened it, there was no one there. The mirror in the hallway seemed to be the focal point of the disturbances. Shadows moved across its surface, and sometimes I would see fleeting figures in the reflection. The whispers grew louder, and the sense of dread became overwhelming. I contacted a local paranormal investigator, Jane, who agreed to visit the house and conduct an investigation. Jane arrived with her team and set up equipment throughout the manor. They used EVP electronic voice phenomena recorders and thermal cameras to detect any paranormal activity. During their investigation, the team captured numerous unexplained sounds and temperature fluctuations. The EVP recordings included disembodied voices and unsettling messages. The most disturbing finding was the thermal camera footage, which showed a shadowy figure moving through the house, lingering around the mirror. Jane performed a cleansing ritual to try to dispel the spirits, but the activity continued, albeit with less intensity. She explained that the spirits might be bound to the house due to the traumatic events that had occurred there. I was left with a lingering sense of unease and decided to take a break from the manor. I stayed with friends and returned periodically to check on the property. Each time, the activity seemed to diminish, but the memories of the haunting remained vivid. Living in Briarwood Manor had been a harrowing experience, and although I had hoped to restore it to its former glory, the supernatural presence made it clear that some places are better left undisturbed. The manor stands as a reminder of its dark past, and I can't help but feel that the spirits of Briarwood Manor are still waiting for something or someone to set them free. My name is Sarah, and I grew up in a small town near Pine Ridge, a place steeped in Native American folklore. The stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting beings with dark intentions were well known, but rarely spoken of openly. It wasn't until a fateful summer night that I experienced the true terror of a skinwalker. The night began like any other. My friends and I were camping in the woods, enjoying a break from our daily routines. The campsite was a familiar spot, surrounded by dense trees and a small clearing where we set up our tents. We spent the evening by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, trying to scare each other with tales of local legends. As the night deepened, we heard strange sounds in the woods, twigs snapping, footsteps, and an eerie rustling that seemed too deliberate to be an animal. We laughed it off as the sounds of the forest, but couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, while the others were asleep, I heard a peculiar noise, a soft, high-pitched whine that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It came from the edge of the clearing, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the darkness, trying to find the source of the noise. As I walked, the whine grew louder, and I saw a figure in the distance, standing still among the trees. The figure was tall and slender, but its form seemed to shift and waver, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was partially obscured by the trees, and its face was hidden in shadow. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure darted towards me with incredible speed. I turned and ran back to the campsite, my heart racing. When I reached the fire, I found my friends awake and alarmed by my sudden return. I tried to explain what I had seen, but they were skeptical. We decided to stay up and keep watch, but the unsettling feeling lingered. In the early hours of the morning, the noises returned. The rustling and snapping were accompanied by a low, growling sound that seemed to come from all directions. We could see shadows moving around the perimeter of the clearing, and the flashlight beams barely penetrated the darkness. The growls grew louder, and the temperature dropped suddenly. We huddled together, trying to stay calm, but the fear was palpable. Then we heard a blood-curdling scream, not far from our campsite. It was a scream of agony and terror, and it seemed to echo through the woods. We shined our flashlights in the direction of the scream, but saw nothing. The sounds of the forest were now eerily silent, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us. We decided it was time to leave. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible and made our way back to town. The drive was tense, and the feeling of being followed never left us. Back home, we learned that similar experiences had been reported by others in the area. Stories of a skinwalker being that could mimic human voices and transform into various animals matched our experience. The legend described a creature that preyed on those who ventured into its territory, using fear and deception to torment its victims. The experience left a lasting impact on all of us. Pine Ridge remained a place of unease, and the stories of skinwalkers became more than just folklore. They were a chilling reminder of the unknown dangers lurking in the dark corners of the world. To this day, I avoid the woods at night and can't shake the feeling that something from that night is still out there, waiting in the shadows. My name is Dave, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years. I've driven through countless stretches of road, but one night on Route 66, I encountered something that defied all explanation. It was a quiet, moonlit night, and I was driving my rig through a remote stretch of Route 66 in Arizona. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the steady rumble of my engine. I was making good time, heading towards my next delivery, when I noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a mirage or some trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man in a faded, old-fashioned suit. He was holding a thumb out, clearly hitchhiking. I slowed down, considering whether to pick him up. The road was desolate, and I felt uneasy about leaving him stranded, but something about his presence seemed off. His clothes were out of place, and his face was partially obscured by shadows. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The hitchhiker climbed into the passenger seat without a word, and I started driving again. The air in the cab grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over me. I glanced at the hitchhiker and noticed he was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. I tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond. The silence was oppressive, and the only sound was the rumble of the truck and the occasional crackle of the radio dot as we drove. I noticed that the landscape outside seemed to change. The familiar road signs and landmarks began to blur, and the scenery became more desolate and foreboding. I asked the hitchhiker where he was headed, but he remained silent. His eyes, though, seemed to follow me, and an uncomfortable chill ran down my spine. After what felt like hours, I decided to pull over and ask him directly if he needed help. When I turned to look at him, I was stunned to find that he was no longer there. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was slightly ajar. I jumped out of the truck and searched around, but there was no sign of him. The road was completely empty, and the silence was deafening. I got back into the truck, my heart racing. The radio crackled to life, and I heard a voice, a distorted, mournful whisper saying, "Thank you for the ride." I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued driving, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly, and I felt like I was driving in circles. Eventually, I reached a small town and stopped at a diner to collect my thoughts. The waitress there, an older woman with a kind face, noticed my distress and asked if everything was all right. When I told her about the hitchhiker, her expression grew solemn. She explained that there had been numerous reports of a ghostly hitchhiker on that stretch of Route 66, a figure who appeared to travelers and vanished without a trace. The stories went back decades, and the hitchhiker was said to be the spirit of someone who had died in a tragic accident on that road. I left the diner with a heavy heart, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that night had followed me. The experience on Route 66 was a chilling reminder of the unknown and the eerie presence that sometimes lurks in the shadows of the road. I've been driving for years, but that night remained etched in my memory, a haunting encounter with a phantom hitchhiker that defied all logic and explanation. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of what happened when I moved into my new home, Maplewood House. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a charming old house with a picturesque garden and a welcoming front porch. The real estate agent had spoken highly of its history and character, and I fell in love with it the moment I stepped inside. The first few days in Maplewood House were uneventful. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and settled into my new routine. The house was as lovely as I had remembered, and the neighborhood seemed friendly. However, by the end of the first week, I began to notice odd occurrences. The lights would flicker, and I'd hear faint noises coming from the attic, noises that sounded like footsteps. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling or the electrical system needing an update. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what sounded like a child's laughter coming from the attic. It was a soft, playful sound, but it was out of place given that the house had been empty for years before I moved in. I went upstairs to investigate, but the attic was empty, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. The occurrences continued and grew more frequent. Doors would open and close on their own, and objects would move from one place to another without explanation. I began to feel an unsettling presence in the house, especially at night. I tried to dismiss it as stress from the move, but the feeling of being watched was persistent and unnerving. One evening, as I was cooking dinner in the kitchen, I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy silhouette that seemed to move across the room before disappearing. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. I checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was locked and secure. As the weeks went by, the disturbances escalated. I found cold spots in various rooms, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. One particularly frightening night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. Despite having locked it before going to sleep, I got out of bed to close it, and as I did, I heard a voice, a low, mournful whisper coming from the hallway. It was indistinct, but it sounded as if someone was trying to communicate. I decided to reach out to a local historian, hoping to learn more about the house's past. She told me that Maplewood House had been the site of a tragic event many years ago. A family had lived there and suffered a series of misfortunes that culminated in a devastating accident. The family had been known for their kindness and community involvement, but their lives were cut short in a fire that destroyed much of the house. The story was that the spirits of the family still lingered, unable to move on from the place where they had met their end. The historian's account matched the experiences I had been having. It seemed that the house was haunted by the spirits of the family who had once lived there. I decided to conduct my own investigation. I set up a camera and voice recorder in the attic and spent the night there, hoping to capture some evidence of the supernatural. Throughout the night, I felt a strong sense of presence, and the temperature in the attic dropped significantly. The voice recorder picked up several instances of disembodied whispers and unexplained noises. The camera captured fleeting shadows moving across the room, although nothing was visible to the naked eye. After reviewing the footage, I contacted a local paranormal investigator. He came to the house and conducted a thorough investigation. He used various tools and techniques to communicate with the spirits and performed a cleansing ritual to help them find peace. The investigator explained that the spirits of the family were likely trapped by their tragic end and that they needed assistance to move on. Following the cleansing, the disturbances in the house diminished. The feeling of being watched faded, and the strange noises became less frequent. While I still felt a lingering sense of connection to the past, the house felt more peaceful. Living in Maplewood House had been a profound experience, and it taught me about the importance of understanding and addressing the unseen forces that can affect our lives. The house was no longer just a home, it was a place with a story, and the spirits that once haunted it had finally found some semblance of peace. My name is Jacob, and I have always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, fishing, you name it, I have done it. So when my buddies and I decided to spend a weekend in Blackwood Forest, I was all in. Blackwood was known for its dense woods and isolated trails, perfect for getting away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But there was another, more ominous reputation that came with Blackwood, a reputation that, at the time, I didn't take seriously. The locals whispered about something that lived deep within the forest. Some called it a bear, others said it was a wolf, but the older folks, those who had lived in the area for generations, warned of a creature far more terrifying. They called it the Beast of Blackwood, a creature that roamed the woods at night, hunting anything that dared to enter its territory. We arrived at Blackwood on a Friday afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip below the treetops. The forest was beautiful, with towering pines and a carpet of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. We set up camp near a small clearing, close to a creek that would provide us with fresh water. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, telling stories and laughing, the way friends do when they're miles away from civilization. But as the night wore on, something changed. The laughter died down, and a heavy silence settled over the camp. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, had gone eerily quiet. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. We brushed it off, blaming the quiet on the lateness of the hour, and eventually we all turned in for the night. I was the last to fall asleep. The crackling of the dying fire and the rustling of the leaves outside my tent lulling me into a restless slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night I was jolted awake by a loud crash. It sounded like something massive had barreled through the trees near our campsite. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The forest was still, save for the sound of heavy breathing. Something large was just outside my tent. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a massive figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, and had a pair of glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The creature stared at me, and I felt a primal fear that I had never experienced before. This was no bear, no wolf. This was something else, something ancient and powerful. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I froze, too terrified to move. The creature took a step forward, and then another, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I was done for. I reached for the flare gun we had brought with us just in case and fired it into the air. The flare burst into a bright, fiery light, illuminating the entire clearing. The beast recoiled, letting out a deafening roar, and then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. My friends, now awake and disoriented, stumbled out of their tents, their faces pale with fear. We didn't wait to see if the creature would return. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible and left the campsite, not stopping until we reached the safety of our cars. As we drove away from Blackwood, the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the forest. But the beauty of the morning did nothing to dispel the terror of the night. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had seen. To this day I can't explain what we encountered that night in Blackwood Forest. Some people say it was just a bear, a trick of the light, or our imaginations playing tricks on us. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the fear that gripped me when I looked into those glowing eyes. The beast of Blackwood is real, and it's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We were just looking for an adventure, a simple escape from our routine lives. My friends Alex, Sarah, and I had always loved hiking, and Pinewood Grove seemed like the perfect spot for our next trip. It was a secluded forest, dense with towering pines and winding trails that had barely seen any visitors in years. Locals whispered tales of people getting lost, of strange sightings, but we didn't believe in such things. We were seasoned hikers, after all. It was just another walk in the woods for us. The day started off normal enough. The sun was shining, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine. We packed our bags with snacks, water, and a map of the area, though none of us expected to actually need it. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, a few miles in and out, with a clear path the entire way. But things quickly took a turn when we came across a narrow, overgrown path that wasn't marked on the map. "Let's check it out," Alex suggested, always the one for taking the road less traveled. Sarah and I hesitated, but our curiosity got the better of us. We ventured onto the path, laughing off any concerns about getting lost. The further we walked, the darker it got. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The temperature dropped, and an unsettling silence fell over the forest. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dry pine needles. We tried to turn back, but the path had twisted and turned so much that we couldn't tell which way we had come from. Our phones had no signal, and the GPS was useless in the dense forest. Panic started to set in, but we kept moving, hoping to find our way back to the main trail. As we continued, we stumbled upon something that made our blood run cold. There, in the middle of the path, was a makeshift campsite, but it was unlike any we had ever seen. The tents were old, covered in mold, and torn to shreds. There were no signs of life, but the remnants of a fire pit suggested someone had been there recently. The eerie part was the carvings and the surrounding trees, strange symbols and figures that none of us recognized. They looked ancient, and their meaning was lost on us, but the sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. Alex, trying to lighten the mood, joked about it being some kind of ritual site, but there was no humor in his voice, only a thinly veiled fear. We decided to move on, hoping to find our way out before it got dark. But as we walked, we started hearing things. A distant rustling in the bushes, footsteps that didn't belong to any of us, and low whispers that seemed to come from all around us. We tried to dismiss it as our imagination, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. It was Sarah who saw at first a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the thick underbrush. She pointed it out, and we all froze. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, dressed in old, tattered clothes with a face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. We called out to him, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring. Then, as if in response to our calls, he slowly raised his hand and pointed down the path, deeper into the forest. That was enough for us. We turned and ran, not caring where the path led, as long as it was away from him. We didn't stop until we were completely out of breath. But when we looked around, we realized we were even more lost than before. The forest had become a maze of identical trees and endless paths that all looked the same. No matter which way we turned, we couldn't find our way back. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. The whispers grew louder, and we could feel eyes on us from every direction. It wasn't just the men anymore. There were others, shadows flitting between the trees, always just out of sight. We tried to keep calm, telling ourselves we would find our way out, but the fear was palpable. Every sound made us jump. Every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. It was as if the forest itself was alive, playing tricks on us, leading us deeper into its depths. And then we found the clearing. It was a wide, open space in the middle of the forest, completely devoid of trees. In the center was an old, crumbling stone altar, covered in the same strange symbols we had seen earlier. Surrounding the altar were dozens of small wooden figures, each one carved with intricate details, depicting twisted, nightmarish forms. We had walked right into the heart of whatever this place was. The shadows that had been following us now closed in, surrounding the clearing, their forms barely distinguishable in the fading light. The man we had seen earlier was among them, standing at the edge of the clearing, still watching, still silent. We were trapped. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the whispers turned into a low, groaning chant. We backed away from the altar, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined, gaunt, hollow-eyed figures that seemed to glide over the ground. Just when we thought it was over, a loud crack echoed through the forest, and the ground beneath us began to shake. The figures stopped their advance, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, as if on cue, they all turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. The chanting ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving us standing in stunned silence. Without wasting a moment, we ran. We didn't stop until we burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road that led to the nearest town. We never looked back, afraid that if we did, we'd see those figures watching us from the tree line. When we reached the town, we told the locals what had happened, but they just shook their heads, their faces grim. "You shouldn't have gone into Pinewood Grove," one old man said. "That place is cursed. People go in, but they don't always come out." We left town the next day, vowing never to speak of what we had seen. But the memories still haunt us, especially at night when the wind howls through the trees, and we hear those whispers again, faint but unmistakable. Pinewood Grove took something from us, something we'll never get back, and it's a place we'll never dare to return to. It was late one night when I found myself standing on the corner of a deserted street, waiting for a taxi. The city had an eerie stillness to it, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the day. After what felt like an eternity, a taxi finally pulled up. It was an old, beat-up cab, the kind that had seen better days. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, gave me a nod as I climbed into the back seat. I gave him my address, and we set off into the night. The ride started off like any other. We drove through the quiet streets, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. But as we got farther from the city center, things started to feel off. The driver was taking a route I didn't recognize, turning down narrow, winding roads that seemed to lead us deeper into the outskirts of town. I tried to ask him where we were going, but he didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. My anxiety began to rise. The streets were getting darker, the buildings more sparse, and I had no idea where we were. I asked him again, more urgently this time, but still he said nothing. That's when I noticed something strange. The air inside the cab had grown cold, so cold that I could see my breath in front of me. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but the chill seemed to seep into my bones. The driver's face remained impassive, but there was something about him that unsettled me. His hands, gripping the steering wheel, looked almost skeletal, and his eyes, those eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I wanted to tell him to stop the car, to let me out, but my voice caught in my throat. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to speak, unable to move. We continued down the desolate road, the taxi's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending path into oblivion. I watched as the buildings disappeared, replaced by thick, looming trees that closed in around us. The forest was dense, the branches overhead intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the moonlight. The only light came from the dim glow of the taxi's dashboard, casting eerie shadows on the driver's face. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there, watching as the world outside grew darker and more menacing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the taxi came to a stop. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, with no sign of civilization in sight. The driver turned to look at me, his eyes piercing into mine. There was something otherworldly about him, something that made my skin crawl. "This is your stop," he said in a voice that was cold and distant. I wanted to protest, to tell him that this wasn't where I lived, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I found myself opening the door and stepping out into the night. The moment I was outside, the taxi sped off, leaving me alone in the dark. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring after the taillights as they disappeared into the distance. The silence was deafening, the darkness oppressive. I had no idea where I was, no idea how to get home. Panic set in, and I began to walk, hoping to find a road, a house, anything that would lead me back to safety. But the farther I walked, the more I realized that I was lost. The forest was a labyrinth of trees and shadows, and I had no sense of direction. The cold was biting, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could hear rustling in the underbrush, the sound of something moving through the trees, and I knew that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short gasps, but the sounds followed me, growing louder, more insistent. I broke into a run, desperate to escape whatever was stalking me. But no matter how fast I ran, the sounds stayed with me. It felt like I was being hunted, like something was toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. But no matter how far I ran, the forest never seemed to end. The trees stretched on for miles, an endless sea of darkness and fear. My thoughts were a whirlwind of terror and confusion. How had I ended up here? What had happened to that taxi driver? And what was chasing me through these woods? I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to process any of it. All I could do was run, driven by an instinctive need to survive. Finally, just as my strength was about to give out, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was there, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, sprinting towards the light, praying that it was real, that it wasn't just another trick of the night. As I got closer, I could make out the outline of a building, a small, dilapidated cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I reached the cabin and threw myself against the door, pounding on it with all my might. "Please, let me in," I shouted, my voice hoarse and desperate. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my fists against the wood and the pounding of my heart in my ears. But then, slowly, the door creaked open. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. I lay there, gasping for breath, trying to collect myself, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that I wasn't alone. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure shrouded in shadow. It was tall and thin, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, just like the taxi driver's. My heart lurched in my chest as the figure began to move towards me, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from it, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was small, the walls closing in around me. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. And then, in a voice that set chills down my spine, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice echoing in the small space. "This is our place, and you don't belong." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the fear that gripped me. The figure reached out towards me, its hand cold and bony, and I knew that this was the end. Just as its hand brushed against my skin, the door to the cabin burst open, and a blinding light filled the room. I heard another voice, familiar and reassuring, calling my name. I turned towards the light, shielding my eyes, and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a ranger's uniform, his face stern but kind. "Come with me," he said, reaching out his hand. "You're safe now." I didn't hesitate. I ran towards him, throwing myself into his arms as the light consumed us both. When I opened my eyes again, I was outside, standing on the edge of the forest. The cabin was gone, the trees silent and still. The ranger was there beside me, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You were lucky," he said. "Most people who go into those woods don't come back. You should count your blessings and never return." I nodded, too shaken to argue. The ranger led me back to his truck, and we drove in silence back to the main road. I never saw that taxi driver again, and I never went back to Blackwood Forest. But I'll never forget that night, the fear that gripped me, and the knowledge that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that are best left undisturbed. The day I found the artifact was supposed to be just another routine dig. I'd been working as an archaeologist for nearly a decade, traveling the world in search of ancient relics and forgotten histories. My latest assignment had taken me to a remote village in South America, nestled deep within the mountains. The locals were friendly enough, though they kept their distance when they learned why I was there. They warned me of the dangers that lay hidden in the earth, tales of curses and spirits that had been passed down through generations. But I had heard those kinds of stories before, and while I respected their beliefs, I didn't take them too seriously. The dig site was located in a clearing at the edge of the jungle, surrounded by thick vegetation and towering trees. It was hot, humid, and the air buzzed with the sound of insects. My team and I set up camp, eager to get started on what we hoped would be a fruitful excavation. We had been there for about a week when we first discovered the chamber. It was buried deep beneath the earth, accessible only through a narrow tunnel that we had painstakingly cleared. The chamber itself was small, with walls made of smooth stone and carvings that depicted scenes of worship and sacrifice. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal, and upon it a strange, ornate box. The box was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was made of a dark, almost black metal, and covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and had no visible seams or hinges. It was as if the box had been forged from a single piece of metal, a feat that should have been impossible given the time period it was from. My first instinct was to leave it alone, to respect whatever ancient power it might hold. But curiosity got the better of me. I carefully lifted the box from the pedestal, examining it from all angles. There were no markings, no inscriptions that gave any clue as to what it was or where it had come from. It was a mystery, one that I was determined to solve. I brought the box back to camp, setting it up on a table in my tent. I spent hours studying it, but no matter what I did, I couldn't figure out how to open it. The box seemed impervious to any tool or method I tried. It was as if it had been sealed by some unknown force, one that refused to reveal its secrets. That night I had the first of many nightmares. I dreamt that I was back in the chamber, standing before the pedestal, but instead of the box, there was a figure tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadow. Its eyes were like burning coals, and it spoke to me in a voice that was neither male nor female, but something in between. "You have taken what is not yours," it said, "and now you will suffer." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that it left me shaken. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days went on, the nightmares grew worse. Every night the figure would return, its presence more menacing, its voice more demanding. It would tell me to return the box, to leave the dig site, or else face the consequences. But by then it was too late. I had become obsessed with the box, with the mystery it represented. I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind, even as strange things began to happen around camp. Equipment would malfunction, tools would go missing, and the locals who worked with us started to quit, one by one, claiming that the site was cursed. My team began to grow uneasy as well. They could sense that something was wrong, even if they didn't know what. The atmosphere in camp became tense, and arguments broke out over the smallest things. It was as if the box was exerting some kind of influence over us, driving us to the brink of madness. One night, as I was sitting in my tent, staring at the box, I heard a noise outside. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of some great beast. I stepped outside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The jungle around us was alive with movement. The trees swayed violently, the ground trembled, and the air was thick with the sound of something unseen, something powerful. The figure from my dreams appeared before me, more solid, more real than ever before. Its eyes burned with an intensity that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. "You have brought this upon yourself," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "The curse is upon you, and there is no escape." The ground beneath me began to shake, and I fell to my knees, clutching the box to my chest. I could feel the power within it, pulsing, growing stronger with each passing second. The figure reached out towards me, its hand like a claw, and I knew that this was the end. But then, just as it was about to touch me, the box in my arms began to glow. It was a faint light at first, but it quickly grew brighter, more intense, until it was blinding. The figure let out a shriek, recoiling from the light, and then it was gone, vanished into the night. The jungle went still, the ground stopped shaking, and I was left alone in the darkness, the box still clutched in my hands. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the box, but when I finally looked up, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The camp was in shambles, my team scattered, but the box was unchanged, as cold and mysterious as ever. I knew then that I had to get rid of it, to return it to the chamber and leave this place for good. But when I went back to the site, the chamber was gone. The tunnel we had dug had collapsed, buried under tons of earth and rock. There was no way to return the box, no way to undo what I had done. I left the dig site that day, never to return. The box is still with me, hidden away in a place where no one will ever find it. But I can still feel its presence, still hear the voice of the figure in my dreams, telling me that the curse is not yet lifted, that my suffering is far from over. I've tried to get rid of it, to destroy it, but nothing works. The box is indestructible, a relic of some ancient evil that I will never fully understand. And so I live in fear, knowing that one day the curse will claim me, that the figure will come for me, and that when it does, there will be no escape. The night started off like any other night in our quiet neighborhood at Willow Creek. The kids were in bed early, exhausted from a long day of play, and my wife Emma and I were finally getting some much-needed time to ourselves. The house was still and peaceful, The only sounds were the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as they settled under the weight of the house. We lived in a modest 2-story home that we had bought a few years ago. Wasn't anything fancy, but it was ours. And we had dated into a warm and welcoming place, the kind of home where you could feel safe and secure. But that sense of security was shattered on that fateful night. It was just after 11 p.m. when the first knock came. It was a soft knock, almost hesitant, but it was enough to pull me out of the half-sleep I had fallen into. On the couch I sat up, listening carefully, thinking I had imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Emma looked at me from her spot on the other end of the couch, her brow furrowed in concern. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, getting to my feet. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. The knock came again, more insistent. I walked to the front door, peering through the peephole, but saw nothing. The porch light was on, illuminating the front steps, but there was no one there. Maybe it was just the wind, I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Emma. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. It was a clear night with hardly a breeze in the air. Something about this felt wrong as I turned away from the door. Another knock echoed through the house. This time it came from the back door. I froze. Emma's eyes widened and she grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. "Who could it be?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I slowly made my way to the kitchen, where the back door was located. The door had a small window near the top, but it was too high to see through. Without standing on something, I reached for a chair, but before I could move it into position, I heard a faint whisper coming from the other side of the door. It was a man's voice, low and almost pleading. "Let me in." The voice set chills down my spine. I backed away from the door, not daring to move any closer. I could feel Emma's eyes on me. Her fear mirrored my own. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver, and I felt there was no response, just silence. Emma took a step forward, phone in hand, ready to dial for help. But before she could do anything, the knock came again, this time from the living room window. We both turned to look, but again there was nothing there. The curtains were drawn, but the light from the street lamps outside cast faint shadows on the fabric, creating the eerie illusion of movement. "This isn't right," I muttered. Emma nodded in agreement, already dialing the number for the police. Just as she started explaining the situation to the dispatcher, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I heard Emma gasp in the darkness, and I quickly made my way back to her, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to calm our nerves. The house felt different now, as if something had changed. The air was thick with tension, and an overwhelming sense of dread hung over us. The knocking continued, moving from door to door, window to window. It was relentless, and each knock was accompanied by that same whispered plea, "Let me in." Whoever it was wasn't going away, and they weren't going to stop until we let them in. Emma was still on the phone with the dispatcher, who assured her that the police were on their way, but their voices seemed distant, muffled, as if they were speaking through a thick fog. I could feel the walls closing in around us, the darkness growing heavier with each passing moment. Then, without warning, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that whoever it was had given up and left. But that hope was short-lived, as the knocking resumed, this time from inside the house. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt Emma's hand tighten around mine. We slowly backed away from the kitchen door, making our way to the stairs. "We need to get the kids," I whispered. Emma nodded, her face pale in the dim light. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. As we climbed the stairs, it was as if whoever or whatever was behind it was desperate to get to us. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to grab the kids and get out of the house. But I couldn't move fast enough. The moment we reached the top of the stairs, the knocking stopped again, leaving us in an oppressive silence. We stood there in the darkness, listening for any sound but the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I turned on the flashlight again, shining it down the hallway toward the kids' rooms. That something was wrong. The hallway seemed longer, stretching out into the darkness far beyond what was possible. It was as if the house itself had changed, morphing into something unfamiliar and menacing. This isn't real, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But the hallway continued to stretch on, and the knocking started again, louder and more insistent, and before we had no choice but to keep moving. But as we walked down the impossibly long hallway, I noticed something strange. The doors to the kids' rooms were gone, replaced by solid walls. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. Where are the doors? Emma whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I had no answer. I could only keep moving forward, hoping that we would find a way out. But with each step, the hallway seemed to grow longer, the walls closing in tighter, until it felt like we were walking in circles. Just when I thought we were trapped for good, the hallway abruptly ended in front of a single door. It was a plain wooden door with no markings, no handle, just a solid slab of wood. It didn't belong there, and I knew it was a trap. We shouldn't open it, I said, my voice shaking. Emma nodded in agreement that we both knew we had no other choice. We were out of options, with nowhere else to go. With a trembling hand, I reached out and touched the door. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold, and I could feel a strong sense of malevolence emanating from the other side. But I had to know what was behind it. I had to find out what had invaded our home. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the door open. The room on the other side was pitch black, devoid of any light or sound. It was a void, an endless abyss that seemed to stretch out into infinity. The knocking had stopped, and the whispers had ceased, leaving us in a suffocating silence. I stepped forward into the darkness, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a shroud. Emma followed closely behind, her grip on my hand tight and desperate. We walked into the void, unsure of where we were going or what we would find. But the further we walked, the more I realized that there was no escape. We were trapped in this darkness, unable to turn back, unable to find our way out. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the inky blackness. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, dressed in tattered clothes, with a face obscured by shadows. He stood motionless, watching us as we approached. I tried to speak, but no words came out, my voice lost in the void. The figure slowly raised his hand, pointing at us, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let us leave. As we stood there, paralyzed by fear, the figure began to move toward us, its steps slow and deliberate. I tried to back away, but the darkness seemed to close around us, trapping us in place. There was no escape, no way out. The figure drew closer and closer until it was just inches away. I could see its face now, twisted and grotesque, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. It reached out to me, its hand cold as ice, and I knew that this was the end. But then something happened. A blinding light filled the room, driving away the darkness, and the figure, the cold, disappeared, and I felt Emma's hand slip out of mine. I blinked against the sudden brightness, disoriented and confused. When my vision cleared, I found myself standing in our living room, the lights on and everything back to normal. Emma was beside me, her face pale and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. The kids were upstairs asleep in their beds just as we had left them. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of the door or the hallway that had stretched out into the darkness. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. We both did. We had experienced something that night, something beyond explanation, and it had left its mark on us. The police arrived shortly after, and we explained what had happened, but they found no evidence of an intruder, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. They chalked it up to a power outage and our imaginations running wild. But we knew the truth. Something had come into our home at night, something that wasn't human, and it had left us with a feeling of unease that would never go away. We never spoke of that night again, not to anyone, not even to each other. but every now and then, when the house is quiet and the lights flicker, I can still hear the faint sound of knocking, and I know that whatever was it's still out there waiting to be let in. It was the dead of night when I first heard about Highway 16. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, crisscrossing the country on countless routes, but there was something about this one that got under my skin. I'd been in a small roadside diner, sipping on bad coffee and trying to stay awake when a fellow trucker, a grizzled old-timer with a face like weathered leather, sat down next to me. He eyed me for a moment, as if sizing me up, then leaned in close, his voice low and gravelly. "You ever heard of the Highway of Tears?" he asked. I shook my head, curious despite myself. "No, can't say I have. Where is it?" The old-timer nodded slowly, like he expected that answer. "Out in British Columbia," he said, "stretches for miles. Out in the middle of nowhere. Lots of folks gone missing out there, truckers included. Some say the place is cursed. Others say it's something worse. Whatever it is, smart folks avoid like the plague." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. I'd heard plenty of stories over the years, tales of haunted highways and ghostly apparitions, but they were just that, stories. Nothing I couldn't handle, or so I thought. A week later, I found myself on a long haul from Vancouver to Prince Rupert, a route that took me through some of the most remote parts of the province. The dispatcher had warned me that it was a tough drive with few places to stop and even fewer signs of civilization, but the pay was good, and I needed the money. It wasn't until I was well into the trip that I realized where I was. The road signs, the thick forest on either side, the utter isolation, it all matched the old-timer's description of Highway 16, the so-called Highway of Tears. By then, it was too late to turn back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and I knew I had to keep going if I wanted to make my delivery on time. The first few hours passed without incident. The road was rough in places, full of potholes and sharp turns, but I'd driven worse. The forest pressed in on either side, the trees tall and dark, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out towards the sky. It was eerie, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. That changed when I reached a stretch of the highway where the trees parted, giving way to a long, straight stretch of road. The moon was high by then, casting a pale light over everything, and that's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, a young woman in a white dress, her long hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She was barefoot, her feet dirty and bleeding, and she held out one hand as if asking for help. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to stop, but something about her gave me pause. There was a look in her eyes, a haunted, hollow look that made my skin crawl. I kept my foot on the brake, and sure of what to do. "You shouldn't be out here," I called through the window. "It's not safe." She didn't respond, just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave her. I rolled down the window a bit more, trying to get a better look at her. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, though every word felt like a mistake. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't say a word. Then, slowly, she nodded, taking a step towards the truck. I hesitated, but the thought of leaving her out there, alone and vulnerable, was too much. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in, moving with a strange, fluid grace. As soon as she was inside, I regretted my decision. The air in the cab grew cold, so cold that I could see my breath in front of me. The woman said nothing, just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I tried to make small talk, to break the tension, but she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I was speaking. The silence was oppressive, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones, making it hard to concentrate on the road. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was a sadness in it that tugged at something deep inside me. "They took me," she said. "They took me, and I never came back." I glanced over at her, but she was still staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Who took you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She didn't respond, just kept talking, as if she hadn't heard me. "I was walking home," she continued. "It was late, and I was tired. I just wanted to get home, but they were there, waiting. I tried to run, but they were too fast. They took me, and I never came back." My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my knuckles white. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that I wanted her out of my truck, out of my life, but I couldn't just leave her out here. Not if there was a chance she was telling the truth. "Where do you need to go?" I asked, hoping that she'd give me some kind of answer, something that would make this nightmare end. She turned to look at me then, and I wish she hadn't. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets where her eyes should have been, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. "They took me," she repeated, her voice growing fainter, more distant. "And now they're coming for you." Panic surged through me, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the deserted highway. I turned to her, but she was gone, vanished into thin air. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked from the inside. I sat there for a long moment, my hands shaking, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? Or was there something more to it? I didn't have time to think about it. The air in the cab was still freezing, and the sense of dread that had settled over me was impossible to shake. I needed to get out of there, to get off that highway before something else happened. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I sped down the highway. The trees blurred past me, the road a dark ribbon stretching out into the night. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, something that I couldn't see. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dark and shadowy, flitting in and out of the trees, keeping pace with the truck. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their movements quick and unnatural. I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring as I tried to outrun them. But they were relentless, drawing closer with every passing second. I could hear them now, the sound of their footsteps pounding against the pavement, the rustle of their clothing as they moved through the trees. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I was running out of time, running out of road. The figures were almost upon me now, their hands reaching out, their eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. I could feel their presence, cold and malevolent, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then, just as they were about to overtake me, I saw it, a small, dimly lit gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. I swerved towards it, the truck skidding on the gravel as I pulled into the parking lot. I jumped out of the cab, my legs trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The gas station was empty, the windows dark, but it was a beacon of light in the darkness, a refuge from the horrors that lurked on the highway. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. The figures outside circled the truck, their eyes glowing in the darkness, but they didn't approach the gas station. It was as if there was something there that kept them at bay, something that they couldn't cross. I stood there, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman, the figures, the sense of dread that had followed me down the highway was all too much, too unreal. I stayed in that gas station until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, until the figures had vanished back into the trees, leaving no trace of their presence. When I finally stepped outside, the world was quiet, still. The truck was untouched, the highway deserted. I got back in the cab, my hand still trembling, and drove away from that place as fast as I could. I never told anyone about what happened on Highway 16. I didn't see the point. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget that night, the woman. I never considered myself a superstitious person. I always thought that those who feared curses or hexes were simply victims of their own paranoia. But that was before I encountered the cursed relic. Now I know better. It all started when I took on a job at a small, family-owned antique shop in my hometown. The shop, Timeless Treasures, had been around for decades, filled with dusty old furniture, vintage jewelry, and knickknacks from eras long past. The place had an odd charm to it, a certain mystique that drew in collectors and curious passers-by alike. I'd been out of work for a few months, and when I saw the help wanted sign in the window, I figured it was as good a place as any to start earning a paycheck again. The owner, Mrs. Holloway, was an elderly woman with a kind smile and a penchant for storytelling. She loved to regale me with tales of the shop's history, of the rare and unusual items that had passed through its doors over the years. But there was one story she never told me, one secret she kept hidden until it was too late. I'd been working at the shop for a few weeks when the relic arrived. It was a small, intricately carved box, made of dark wood and adorned with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Mrs. Holloway found it in a crate of items she'd purchased at an estate sale. The moment I laid eyes on it, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. There was something about the box that didn't sit right with me, something that made my skin crawl. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just another old trinket, nothing more. Mrs. Holloway seemed fascinated by the box. She spent hours examining it, running her fingers over the carvings, muttering to herself as she tried to decipher the symbols. She told me it was a rare find, possibly a relic from some long-forgotten civilization. I didn't share her enthusiasm. There was something about the box that made me uneasy, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. A few days after the box arrived, strange things started happening around the shop. At first, it was little things items would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. The lights would flicker, the temperature in the shop would drop suddenly, and I'd hear strange noises, like whispers, coming from the back room. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, I was alone in the shop, sorting through a box of old books, when I heard a loud crash from the back room. My heart raced as I got up to investigate. When I reached the back room, I found the cursed box on the floor, its lid slightly ajar. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The room was freezing cold, my breath visible in the air. I hesitated for a moment, then bent down to pick up the box. As my fingers touched the wood, a sharp pain shot through my hand like an electric shock. I recoiled, clutching my hand as I stared at the box in horror. The symbols on the lid seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with an unnatural light. I wanted to run, to get out of that shop, and never look back, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. It was as if the box was calling to me, pulling me in with an invisible force. Against my better judgment, I reached out again, this time using a cloth to shield my hand, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, I found a small black stone, smooth and cold to the touch. The moment I saw it, I knew it was the source of the curse. The air around me seemed to thrum with energy, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I quickly closed the box, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. That evening, I told Mrs. Halloway about what had happened, expecting her to dismiss my concerns. But to my surprise, her face grew pale, and she seemed genuinely frightened. She explained that the box had been sealed for a reason, that it was never meant to be opened. The relic inside was cursed, she said, bound to a powerful and malevolent spirit that had been trapped for centuries. She had intended to keep it hidden, to protect the shop and everyone in it. But now that the box had been opened, the curse was free to spread. Panic set in as she recounted stories of the box's previous owners, all of whom had met untimely and violent ends. She urged me to leave the shop, to put as much distance between myself and the relic as possible. But it was too late. The curse had already taken hold. Over the next few days, my life descended into chaos. I was plagued by nightmares, visions of shadowy figures and terrifying creatures that haunted my every waking moment. Objects in my apartment moved on their own, lights flickered, and strange, guttural sounds echoed through the halls. I was being hunted, tormented by the very spirit that had been trapped within the box. No matter where I went, the curse followed. Desperate for answers, I did some research on the symbols carved into the box. What I discovered only confirmed my worst fears. The relic was an ancient artifact, a vessel for trapping dark spirits used by a long-forgotten sect of sorcerers. The spirit inside was said to be one of the most powerful and vengeful, a malevolent force that fed on fear and suffering. It had been sealed away centuries ago, its power contained within the stone. But by opening the box, I had unleashed it, and now it was free to wreak havoc once more. I tried everything to rid myself of the curse. I consulted with priests, shamans, and occult experts, but nothing worked. The spirit was too powerful, too entrenched in my life. It wanted revenge, and would stop at nothing until it had claimed me as its next victim. The final straw came one night when I awoke to find the box on my bedside table, the lid open, and the stone glowing faintly in the darkness. The air in my room was thick with the scent of decay, and I could feel the presence of the spirit, watching me, waiting. I knew then that there was no escape. The spirit had claimed me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to return the box to the shop, hoping that by putting it back where it came from, I could at least contain the curse. But when I arrived, I found the shop in ruins. The windows were shattered, the shelves overturned, and Mrs. Halloway was nowhere to be found. The cursed box lay in the center of the chaos, the stone glowing brighter than ever. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and felt the cold seep into my bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as I carried the box outside and set it on the ground. I knew what I had to do. I had to destroy it, to break the curse once and for all. But as I raised the box above my head, ready to smash it against the pavement, the spirit made its final move. The ground beneath me shook, and a violent gust of wind knocked me off my feet. The box flew out of my hands, landing a few feet away. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could reach it, the box exploded in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the box and the stone were gone. The curse had been lifted, but at a terrible cost. The shop was destroyed, Mrs. Halloway was missing, and I was left with the knowledge that I had unleashed a force of unimaginable evil upon the world. I never returned to timeless treasures. I couldn't bear the thought of what I had done, of the lives that had been ruined because of my curiosity. The cursed relic may have been destroyed, but its legacy lived on, a dark stain on my soul that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The job was supposed to be easy, just a simple night shift at the Havenbrook warehouse, a sprawling facility on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. My job was to sit in the security office, monitor the cameras, and make sure everything stayed quiet through the night. The pay was decent, and the hours were flexible, so I figure it would be a breeze at least. That's what I thought at first. The warehouse itself was massive, rows upon rows of tall metal shelves stacked with boxes and pallets filled with all sorts of goods. From the outside it looked like any other industrial building, bland and unremarkable. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy from the moment I stepped inside. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor, or maybe it was the eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. Whatever was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My first few nights were uneventful. I would sit in the office sipping my coffee and flipping through channels on the small TV mounted on the wall. The security cameras showed nothing but empty aisles and dark corners, and the occasional rat scurrying across the floor. It was boring as hell, but I didn't mind. A boring job meant no trouble, and that was just fine by me. But then things started to get strange. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on a door. At first I thought it was just the building settling, maybe the wind rattling a loose panel or something, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. I glanced at the monitors, but the camera showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the same empty aisles and shelves. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was late, and I was tired, but the tapping wouldn't stop. It seemed to be coming from different parts of the warehouse, moving from one end to the other. I couldn't pinpoint its exact location, and that only made it more unsettling. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and left the safety of the security office, the tapping guiding me deeper into the warehouse. The place was a labyrinth of crates and boxes, towering above me like silent sentinels. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and the distant hum of machinery. I followed the sound, weaving my way through the narrow aisles until I reached the far corner of the building. That's when I saw a door that I hadn't noticed before. It was old and rusted, its surface pitted and scarred with age. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the metal bare and exposed. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The tapping was louder now, coming from just beyond the door, as if someone or something was on the other side, trying to get out. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. A cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open it, but something compelled me to do it anyway. Slowly I turned the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, protesting. After years of disuse, the room beyond was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. I took a step inside, my footfalls echoing in the empty space. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I could barely see a thing, the light from my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. I swept the beam across the room, revealing old machinery and stacks of crates covered in dust. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could explain the noise I had heard. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. The far end of the room was barely visible, just a silhouette against the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there watching me with eyes that I couldn't see, but could feel. A cold dread settled over me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure, but it remained motionless. Then, without warning, the lights in the warehouse flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking with fear. I had to call for help, but when I finally got the radio out, all I heard was static. I tried to speak into it, but my voice was drowned out by the crackling. No, as I turned back toward the door, but the room had changed. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick and suffocating. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stumbled through the dark, my flashlight flickering weakly as I searched for the exit. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. The warehouse seemed to twist and turn around me, the aisles merging into one another, until I couldn't tell where I was anymore. Panic set in, my breathing growing rapid and shallow as I realized I was trapped in this maze of metal and concrete. I tried to calm myself, to think logically, but it was no use. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and I knew that if I didn't find a way out soon, I'd lose my mind. Just when I thought all hope was lost, the lights flickered back on the warehouse. Was just as it had been before, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. I found myself standing near the door I had opened, but the room beyond was gone. There was no figure, no machinery, just a solid wall where the door had been. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling as I backed away from the wall. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay here any longer. I hurried back to the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat down in the chair, my mind reeling from the experience. What had I seen? Was it just my imagination, or was there something more to it, something that defied explanation? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, but nothing else happened. No more tapping, no more figures in the shadows. It was as if the warehouse had returned to normal, but I knew better. Something had changed that night, something that I couldn't explain. When my shift ended, I handed in my resignation and never looked back. I didn't care about the pay or the hours. I just wanted to get as far away from Havenbrook warehouse as possible. I don't know what I encountered that night, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left alone, and whatever was in that warehouse is one of them. Even years later, I can still hear the faint tapping sound echoing in my mind, a reminder of the night I came face to face with something I couldn't understand, something that still haunts me to this day. When I first laid eyes on Blackthorn Manor, I knew I had to have it. The sprawling Victorian mansion sat at the edge of town, shrouded in mystery and overgrown with ivy. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot by its previous owners, but I saw potential in its decaying walls. I was a successful architect, known for my ability to restore old buildings to their former glory. Blackthorn Manor was my next big project, a challenge that would cement my reputation as one of the best in the business. But I didn't know then what I was getting myself into. The locals warned me about the house. They told stories of strange occurrences, of people who had entered the manor and never returned. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. But I didn't believe in such things. I was a man of science, of logic and reason, and I dismissed their warnings as nothing more than superstition. I bought the house for a steal, and soon after I began the renovations. The first few weeks went smoothly. My team and I worked tirelessly to strip away the layers of neglect revealing the beauty hidden beneath. The house was magnificent, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floors. But as we delved deeper into the renovations, strange things started happening. At first, it was just little things. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. The electricity would flicker, even though the wiring was brand new. And then there were the sounds. At night, when the house was quiet and the workers had gone home, I would hear footsteps echoing through the halls, doors creaking open and shut, and faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the house settling or to the wind rattling the old windows. But as the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent, more intense. My workers started to complain. Some refused to come back, saying they felt like they were being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. I couldn't afford to lose my crew, so I assured them that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to stay at the house. I wanted to experience the strange occurrences for myself, to see if there was any truth to the stories. I set up a makeshift bed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, and as night fell, I settled in, determined to keep my eyes and ears open. The house was eerily silent at first, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. But as the hours passed, the silence was broken by the faintest of whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear words, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, and that's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there, echoing through the hall outside my door. My heart raced as I got out of bed and opened the door, expecting to find one of my workers playing a prank on me. But the hallway was empty, bathed in the dim light of the moon filtering through the windows. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, and closed the door. But as I turned back to the bed, I froze. There, standing at the foot of the bed, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, her hair long and tangled. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she stared at me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. The woman raised her hand, pointing at something behind me, and as I turned to look, the room went dark. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, the morning sun streaming through the windows. I sat up, my head pounding, and looked around. The room was empty, the figure gone. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a figment of my exhausted mind, but deep down I knew it was real. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. I didn't want to scare my workers, or worse, have them think I was losing my mind. But the occurrences didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps more frequent. And the figure, she appeared every night, always pointing at something I couldn't see. One day, while tearing down a wall in the basement, one of my workers uncovered a hidden room. It was small, just big enough for a bed and a dresser, but it was what was inside that made my blood run cold. The room was filled with old, rotting furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there, on the bed, was a life-size doll, dressed in the same tattered gown as the figure I had seen. Its eyes were glassy, its face cracked and worn, but it was unmistakable. It was her, the woman from my visions. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized what this meant. The figure wasn't just a ghost. She was something more, something that had been trapped in the house for decades, maybe even longer, and now she was free. I wanted to leave, to abandon the project and never look back. But I couldn't. I had invested too much time, too much money to walk away now. So I did the only thing I could think of. I locked the room back up, sealed it behind a new wall, and tried to forget about it. But she didn't let me forget. The visions grew more intense, more terrifying. She appeared in my dreams, in the corners of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And then one night she spoke. I was lying in bed, trying to get some sleep, when I heard her voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was clear. "Help me," she said. "Please help me." I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. But she wasn't there. Her voice echoed in my mind, and I knew I couldn't ignore her any longer. The next morning, I returned to the hidden room. I broke down the wall and stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The doll was still there, lying on the bed, but this time it was different. Its eyes were open, staring up at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed against its cold skin, the room grew dark. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway. She looked at me with those hollow eyes, and for the first time I felt a deep sadness emanating from her. She wasn't here to hurt me. She was here to beg for my help. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond, but she pointed to the doll, her expression pleading. I knew what I had to do. I took the doll, wrapped it in a cloth, and carried it out of the house. I drove to the nearest church, the doll feeling heavier with each passing mile. When I arrived, I handed it to the priest, explaining what I had found. He listened, his face grave, and agreed to help. Together, we buried the doll in the churchyard, under the watchful eye of the cross. The moment the dirt covered the doll, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The presence that had haunted me for weeks was gone, and the house was silent once more. I returned to Blackthorn Manor, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, but she was gone. The house felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. I finished the renovations, but I never stayed in the house after dark again. I sold it as soon as it was completed to a couple who were thrilled to own a piece of history. I didn't tell them about the curse, about the figure that had haunted my dreams. I didn't want to scare them, to burden them with the knowledge of what had happened there. But as I handed over the keys, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. The house may have been restored to its former glory, but its secrets would remain buried, hidden behind the walls I had built. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of her, that one day she would return, searching for someone to help her find peace once more. I grew up in a small town where not much ever happened. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life was simple. But there was one thing that every kid in town knew about, something that both fascinated and terrified us: the old abandoned factory on the edge of town. The factory had been closed for decades, long before I was born, but the stories about it had been passed down from generation to generation. According to legend, the factory was once a thriving business, producing textiles that were shipped all over the country. But something terrible happened there, something so awful that the factory was shut down overnight, and the owners left town, never to return. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the rumors were enough to keep most people away. They said the factory was cursed, that anyone who entered would never come out. There were stories of people who had gone inside on a dare and were never seen again. Some said the factory was haunted by the spirits of the workers who had died there. while others believed it was something much darker. When I was a teenager, my friends and I decided to investigate. We were young and stupid, and we thought we were invincible. The stories about the factory had always intrigued me, and I was eager to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. So one Friday night, we gathered at the edge of town, flashlights in hand, and set off toward the factory. The factory loomed in the distance, a hulking mass of brick and metal that seemed to grow larger as we approached. The windows were broken, the walls covered in graffiti, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. It was the kind of place that made your skin crawl, but we were determined to see it through. We reached the main gate, which had long since rusted away, and stepped inside. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the ground was littered with broken glass and debris. We made our way to the main building, a massive structure that towered above us, its windows staring down like empty eyes. The door was ajar, and we pushed it open with a creak that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, the factory was a maze of corridors and staircases, all leading deeper into the darkness. The air was stale, and every step we took kicked up clouds of dust. Our flashlights barely pierced the gloom, and the shadows seemed to move just out of sight. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the walls were closing in on us, and the silence was so thick it felt like a living thing. We walked through the factory, our footsteps echoing in the silence, and it wasn't long before we started hearing things. At first, it was just faint whispers, like someone was talking just out of earshot. But as we went deeper, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a conversation, like multiple voices were speaking at once. We tried to ignore it, to tell ourselves it was just the wind or our minds playing tricks on us. But then we started hearing footsteps that weren't ours, footsteps that seemed to follow us wherever we went. We were all on edge, our nerves frayed by the oppressive atmosphere and the strange sounds. I could see the fear in my friends' eyes, and I knew they could see it in mine. But none of us wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. We didn't want to admit we were scared, but the factory had other plans. As we rounded a corner, we came face to face with a door that was slightly ajar. It looked different from the others we had passed, newer, less worn. Something about it drew us in, and before we knew it, we were opening the door and stepping inside. The room was small and empty, except for a single object in the center. It was an old wooden chair, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught our attention was the rope that was tied to the ceiling, ending in a noose that dangled just above the chair. It looked like something out of a nightmare, and for a moment, none of us could move. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air grew cold. I could see my breath in front of me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to leave, to run as far away from that room as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the room itself was holding us there, forcing us to confront whatever horror had taken place. One of my friends, Kevin, stepped forward, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the chair. The moment his fingers brushed against the wood, the room went dark. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in, and we scrambled to find the door, but it was gone. The walls closed in around us, the whispers turned to screams, and I felt something cold and clammy brush against my skin. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, reaching out to pull us into its depths. We were trapped, and the factory wasn't letting us go. I don't know how long we were in that room, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. The screams echoed in my ears, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. But just when I thought we were done for, the door burst open, and light flooded the room. We stumbled out, gasping for air, our hearts racing. The factory was silent again, the whispers and screams gone as if they had never been there. We didn't look back as we ran for the exit, desperate to get out of that place. We never talked about what happened that night. We couldn't, the memories were too raw, too terrifying, but we all knew one thing. The factory wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. Something evil had happened there, something that still lingered in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We never went back to the factory, and we warned others to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers, the screams echoing in my mind. And I know, deep down, that the factory is still out there, waiting, biding its time until someone else is foolish enough to venture inside. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and demons were the stuff of movies and campfire stories, not something that could actually happen in real life. I had heard the tales of haunted houses and cursed objects, but I never put much stock in them. They were just stories meant to scare people, nothing more. So when I found the old doll at a flea market one sunny Saturday afternoon, I didn't think much of it. It was a small porcelain doll with a cracked face and faded clothes, nothing particularly special or unusual about it. The vendor was an elderly woman with a wrinkled face and kind eyes. She told me that the doll had been in her family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, but now with no daughters of her own, she had decided to sell it. I'm not sure what drew me to the doll. Maybe it was the way it looked so out of place among the other items for sale, or maybe it was the way the woman spoke about it with such reverence and nostalgia. Whatever it was, I felt compelled to buy it. It was cheap, only a few dollars, so I figured why not? It would make a nice addition to the bookshelf in my living room, something to give the place a bit of character. I took the doll home and placed it on the shelf next to a few old books and trinkets I had collected over the years. It looked right at home there, almost as if it had always belonged. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things happening in my apartment. At first it was just little things that could easily be explained away. A book would fall off the shelf even though I knew I had placed it securely. A picture frame would be slightly tilted, even though I was certain it had been straight when I left the room. And then there were the cold spots, patches of air that felt inexplicably chilly even though the rest of the room was warm. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nothing more than my imagination. But the incidents became more frequent, more difficult to dismiss. I would come home from work to find the doll in a different position, and I had left it sometimes facing a different direction or sitting at a different angle. I knew it wasn't possible. No one else had access to my apartment, and I certainly hadn't moved it myself. But there it was every day in a new spot, always watching, always waiting. I started to feel uneasy in my own home. The once comforting space now felt oppressive, heavy with an unseen presence. I would hear faint whispers at night, soft and unintelligible, but undeniably there they seemed to come from the direction of the doll. But whenever I turned on the lights, the apartment was silent. I couldn't sleep, the whispers keeping me awake until the early hours of the morning. I began to feel like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me at all times. It was an unsettling feeling, one that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I had had a nightmare, though I couldn't remember the details. All I knew was that I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I glanced around the room, my eyes eventually landing on the doll sitting on the shelf in the corner. It was still in the same spot I had left it, but something about it seemed different the shadows played tricks on my eyes, making it look as though the doll's cracked porcelain face was contorted in a sinister smile. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was imagining things. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong with that doll, something evil. I decided then and there that I couldn't keep it in my apartment any longer. I had to get rid of it. But the thought of touching it filled me with a sense of dread, as if some part of me knew that doing so would only make things worse. The next morning I gathered up the courage to take the doll outside. I didn't want to just throw it away. Something inside me told me that wouldn't be enough, so I took it to a nearby park, planning to bury somewhere out of sight and out of mind. But as I dug the small hole beneath a tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally placed the doll in the ground and began to cover it with dirt, I felt a sudden rush of cold air pass over me. The whispers returned. Louder now, more insistent. They were coming from all around me, filling my ears with unintelligible words. I stumbled back from the grave, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder until they were almost deafening. And then, suddenly, as they had started, they stopped. The air was still, the park eerily quiet. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the doll buried beneath the tree. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. What the feeling of being watched followed me home. I tried to go about my life as usual, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The doll was gone, but the strange occurrences continued. The cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched was all still there, just as strong as before. I started to have nightmares every night, dark, twisted visions of the doll, its cracked face smiling at me as it whispered horrible things into my ear. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and the feeling of dread weighing heavy on my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The doll was buried far away from my apartment, yet it still felt like it had a hold on me, like it was somehow still with me. I started doing research, looking for answers, but what I found only made things worse. Stories of cursed objects, haunted dolls possessed by malevolent spirits. They were all too similar to my own experience. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the doll had been possessed by something evil, something that had latched onto me, and I brought it home. I knew I had to do something drastic. If I wanted to rid myself of the curse, I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for the next strange occurrence or terrifying nightmare. So I sought out help. A local priest who specialized in exorcisms. He was an old man with kind eyes and a calming presence, the kind of person who instinctively trusts. I told him everything about the doll, the strange occurrences, and the nightmares. He listened patiently, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, he told me that what I was experiencing was indeed a possession. The doll had been a vessel for a malevolent spirit, one that had attached itself to me when I brought the doll into my home. The only way to rid myself of the curse was to perform a ritual of cleansing to sever the connection between me and the spirit. It was a long and complicated process involving prayers and the use of holy water. The priest led me through the ritual, guiding me as we prayed and invoked the power of the divine to banish the spirit. As we worked, I felt a strange sensation, a tingling in my skin like static electricity. The air around us grew colder, the whispers returning, faint and distant this time, but still there. But as the ritual continued, the whispers began to fade, the cold spots disappearing until the air was still once more. When we finished, the priest assured me that the spirit was gone, till I was free of its influence. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that it was finally over, but some part of me couldn't shake the lingering fear. The nightmares stopped, the strange occurrences ceased, but the feeling of being watched never truly went away. It was faint now, almost imperceptible, but it was still there lurking in the back of my mind. I moved away from that apartment a few months later, hoping that a change of scenery would help me move on. But even in my new home, I can't escape the feeling that I'm not alone, that somewhere out there the spirit is still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. I've tried to put it all behind me, tried to convince myself that it's over, that I'm safe, but deep down I know that some things once unleashed can never truly be contained. The doll may be gone, but the spirit it carried will haunt me for the rest of my life. I had been driving a taxi for over 10 years, working the night shift in the city. It was a tough job, but it paid the bills, and there was something peaceful about the quiet streets in the dead of night. You see all kinds of people during those hours: the late-night partygoers, the exhausted workers, the occasional troublemaker. But there was one night, one fare, that I'll never forget. It was a Friday night, or rather early Saturday morning. The clock on my dashboard read 2:45 a.m., and I was driving through one of the quieter neighborhoods, hoping to pick up a fare before heading home. The streets were empty, the city bathed in a soft, eerie glow from the street lights. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the corner of Elm Street, right under a flickering street light. Her head was bowed, and her long, dark hair hid her face. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to shimmer in the light, and she looked out of place, like she didn't belong there. I slowed down and pulled up next to her. Rolling down the passenger window, I called out, "Need a ride?" She didn't respond at first, just stood there, unmoving. I was about to drive off, thinking she might not have heard me, when she suddenly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something unsettling about the way she stared at me. It was as if she was looking right through me, into my soul. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe she was just one of those odd characters you sometimes encounter on the night shift. She nodded slowly, almost mechanically, and got into the back seat without a word. The moment she closed the door, the temperature in the cab seemed to drop. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was sitting stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful, but there was no response. She just kept staring ahead, her expression blank. I waited for a moment, hoping she would say something, but the silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. "Miss, where would you like to go?" I tried again, but it was like talking to a statue. Just when I was about to ask her to leave the cab, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and there was a strange, echoing quality to it, like it was coming from far away. "Take me to Maplewood Cemetery." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Maplewood Cemetery was on the outskirts of town, a place I usually avoided. It was old, abandoned, and had a reputation for being haunted. Not exactly a popular destination, especially at this hour, but a fare was a fare, and I needed the money. "All right, Maplewood Cemetery it is," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I put the cab in gear and started driving. The streets seemed darker than usual, the streetlights casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. The woman in the back seat didn't say another word. She just sat there, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. The silence was unnerving, and I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than usual, half expecting her to disappear or do something strange. As we got closer to the cemetery, the city lights faded, replaced by the dense darkness of the surrounding woods. The road became narrower, winding through the trees, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more menacing. I could feel the tension in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. We finally reached the entrance to Maplewood Cemetery. The iron gates stood open, creaking slightly in the wind. The cemetery was shrouded in darkness, the gravestones barely visible in the dim light. I pulled up to the entrance and stopped the cab. "We're here," I said, turning around to face my passenger. But when I looked in the back seat, it was empty. The woman was gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but there was no one there. The door hadn't opened. I hadn't heard a sound, and yet she was gone. My heart started pounding in my chest. I quickly got out of the cab, looking around, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The air was cold, the wind rustling through the trees, but there was no one there. Just me and the silent gravestones. I got back into the cab, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what to think. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I just tired, my mind playing tricks on me? But then I looked at the back seat again, and there was the faint impression of someone sitting there, the fabric of the seat slightly indented, as if she had only just been there. I didn't wait around to find out more. I floored the gas pedal and sped away from the cemetery, the cab bouncing over the rough road as I made my way back to the city. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit, busy street, where I finally pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, but the image of that woman, her dark eyes, and that empty back seat haunted me. When I finally made it home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. The next day, I went to the cab company's office to check the dashcam footage, hoping it would provide some answers, but when I watched the recording, there was nothing there. No woman, no passenger, nothing, just me, talking to myself and driving to the cemetery. It was like she had never existed. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. That night changed me. I still drive the night shift, but I avoid the quieter streets, especially near the cemetery. And every now and then, when the night is at its darkest and the streets are empty, I think about that woman, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for another taxi to pick her up. The house had been in my family for generations, a sprawling old Victorian, with creaky floorboards and a maze of rooms that seemed to go on forever. It had once been a grand estate, a symbol of wealth and status. But by the time it came into my possession, it was a shadow of its former self. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked, and the entire place felt like it was on the verge of collapsing. It wasn't exactly the kind of place I had imagined myself living in, but when my parents passed away and left it to me, I didn't have much of a choice. I couldn't afford to sell it, and buying a new place wasn't an option. So I packed up my life and moved into the old family home, telling myself that I would make the best of it. But from the moment I set foot in that house, I felt uneasy. There was something off about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just the age of the house or the way it groaned and creaked in the wind. It was something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in a big empty house full of shadows and strange noises. Of course, I was going to feel a little on edge, but as the days went by, the feeling only grew stronger. I would hear strange noises at night, faint thumps and shuffling sounds coming from the attic above my bedroom. At first I brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe the wind. But as the nights passed, the noises became more frequent, more deliberate. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for what I was hearing. But deep down I knew that something wasn't right. The noises didn't sound like the creaking of old wood or the rustling of leaves. They sounded like footsteps, like someone or something was moving around in the attic. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me at all times, following my every move I would catch. Glimpses of shadows out of the corner of my fleeting and insubstantial, but always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I knew I should have checked the attic, should have gone up there to see what was causing the noises. But every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted with fear. Something inside me told me that I didn't want to know what was up there, that whatever it was better left alone. So I avoided the attic. I locked the door that led up there and tried to pretend that it didn't exist. But the noises didn't stop. They only got worse, louder, more insistent. It was like whoever or whatever was up there knew that I was ignoring it and was trying to get my attention. One night the noises were so loud that I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and the old rusted key that unlocked the attic door and made my way upstairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the key. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty house, and I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The attic was a mess, full of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, boxes piled high with forgotten belongings, and the faint smell of mildew. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. But there was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything that could have been making the noises. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself that it must have been the wind or maybe some animal that had found its way inside. But as it turned to leave, I heard a soft, raspy whisper coming from the far corner of the attic. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned back towards the sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure crouched in the corner. Its back was to me, its form hunched and twisted like it was trying to make itself small. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I could only stare at the figure as it slowly turned to face me. The flashlight flickered for a moment, plunging the attic into darkness. When it came back on, the figure was gone. I stood there frozen in place, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been real? Had I actually seen someone or something in the attic? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? I backed out of the attic as quickly as I could, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I didn't sleep at night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the corner, his twisted form seared into my mind. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't care about the family legacy or the memories that were tied to the place. I just knew that I couldn't stay here any longer. I found a cheap motel on the edge of town and checked in for the night, planning to return to the house the next day to gather my things. But when I went back the following morning, the house was silent. The noises were gone. The feeling of being watched had disappeared. It was like whatever had been there had left along with me. I gathered my belongings as quickly as I could, planning to sell the house as soon as possible. I didn't care about the money or the history of the place. I just wanted to be rid of it. But as I was leaving, I made one last mistake. I turned back towards the attic door and listened. In the stillness of the house, I heard it again, that same soft, raspy whisper coming from the other side of the door. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran out of the house and never looked back. I sold the place a few weeks later to a young couple who seemed excited to move, and I didn't tell them about the noises, about the figure in the attic. I just wanted to be done with it. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling outside my window, I think about that house. I wonder if the couple ever heard the noises, if they ever felt the same sense of dread that I did, or if maybe, just maybe, whatever was in that attic is still there waiting for its next uninvited guest. When I first heard about Black Hollow, it was from an old-timer at the local bar. He was a grizzled man with a face weathered by years of hard living, the kind of guy who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. I had just moved to the area, looking to start fresh after a rough patch in my life, and I was eager to learn about the town's history. Black Hollow, he told me, was a place the locals didn't talk about much anymore. It was an old mining town nestled deep in the mountains, about an hour's drive from where we sat. Back in the early 1900s, it was a thriving community built on the wealth of a rich vein of coal that ran through the hills. But then something happened, something that drove the townsfolk away. 10 left the place abandoned. The old man leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told me about the curse of Black Hollow, how the town had been haunted by a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances that no one could explain. It started with the miners, who would go into the tunnels and never come back. Their bodies were never found, just their tools and helmets, left behind as if they had vanished into thin air. Then it spread to the rest of the town. People started seeing strange things, shadows moving on their own, whispers in the night, and figures standing just out of sight, watching. Some said it was the spirits of the miners, angry at the living for disturbing their rest. Whatever it was, the people of Black Hollow were terrified. They tried to leave, but the curse followed them. Those who fled the town didn't fare much better. Many of them died in bizarre accidents or simply disappeared, never to be seen again. In the end, the town was abandoned, left to rot in the mountains, forgotten by the world. But the curse remained. The old man finished his story and sat back, taking a long drink from his glass. They say if you go up there now, he said, you can still hear the miners, still see their shadows moving in the dark. And if you're not careful, the curse will get you too. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a ghost story meant to scare newcomers. But something about it stuck with me, knowing at the back of my mind. I've always been curious, maybe too curious for my own good, and the thought of exploring an abandoned town intrigued me. So one weekend I decided to check it out for myself. I packed a bag with some essentials, a flashlight, a few snacks, a map of the area, and set off for Black Hollow. The drive was longer than I expected, the road winding through dense forests and steep cliffs. As I got closer, the trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder, the sky darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the town, I was struck by how quiet it was. The buildings were old and crumbling, overgrown with ivy and moss. The streets were empty, no sign of life anywhere. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, left untouched since the day it was abandoned. I parked my car near what looked like the town square and got out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. I could hear the wind whistling through the empty buildings, a creak of old doors swinging on rusted hinges. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The town felt wrong, like something was missing. There were no birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of the mountains. I made my way to the entrance of the mine, a dark hole in the side of the mountain, half collapsed and overgrown with weeds. The old wooden beams that supported the entrance were rotting, and I could see the remnants of old equipment scattered around, rusted carts, broken picks, and shovels. The air around the mine was colder than the rest of the town, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached. I hesitated at the entrance, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the blackness, revealing only jagged walls and the gaping maw of the tunnel that led deeper into the mountain. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the idea of going inside made my stomach turn. As I stood there, I heard something faint at first, but growing louder. It was a rhythmic sound, like the distant echo of metal on stone. It sounded like someone was working deep inside the mine, hammering away at the rock. The sound was so real, so clear, that I almost called out, but something stopped me. The old man's story flashed through my mind, and I felt a surge of fear. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I backed away from the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound continued, growing louder, closer. I turned and started walking quickly back toward the town square, trying to keep my composure. But as I walked, I heard another sound, a whispering, like dozens of voices speaking at once. It was coming from the shadows, from the buildings around me. The wind picked up, howling through the town, and I could feel the eyes on me, watching, waiting. I started to run. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get out of that town, away from the mine, away from whatever was out there. The whispers grew louder, the shadows longer, and I could see figures moving in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. I finally got the door opened and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The whispers were right outside, pressing against the windows, filling my ears. I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind me as I sped down the road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of the city. Even then, I didn't feel safe. The whole way home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but the road was empty. When I finally got back to my apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, trying to process what had happened. The fear slowly faded, replaced by a deep unease. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, but I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just my imagination, the power of suggestion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Black Hollow was cursed, and I had barely escaped with my life. I never went back to that town, and I never told anyone about what I experienced. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that whispering, that faint echo of metal on stone, and I know that the curse of Black Hollow is still out there, waiting for its next victim. It was the final week of shooting for The Conjuring, and everyone was exhausted but eager to wrap up the production. The air was thick with anticipation and a sense of unease that had been growing steadily over the past few days. Strange occurrences had become almost routine, lights flickering, equipment malfunctioning, and the pervasive feeling of being watched. Vera Farmiga, who played Lorraine Warren, had been having troubling dreams since the beginning of the shoot. She confided in me one afternoon during a break. We were sitting in her trailer, and she looked visibly shaken. "I've been having these nightmares," she said, her voice trembling. "They're so vivid, so real. I wake up feeling like something's in the room with me." I listened intently as she described the dreams. They always started the same way. She was in her hotel room, lying in bed, when a dark figure would appear at the foot of the bed. The figure was tall and shadowy, its face obscured. It would slowly move closer, and just as it was about to touch her, she would wake up, drenched in sweat and unable to shake the feeling of dread. "I feel like it's trying to tell me something," Vera continued, her eyes wide with fear, "but I don't know what it wants." I tried to reassure her, suggesting that the stress of the shoot and the nature of the film might be influencing her dreams, but deep down I felt a chill. There was something about the way she described the figure that resonated with the strange occurrences on set. That night I stayed late to review the day's footage. The set was quiet, save for the hum of the editing equipment. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. I dismissed it as fatigue and continued my work. Just as suddenly as it began, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the room grew warmer. Father Michael finished his prayers and turned to us. "It is done," he said, "but you must remain vigilant. These entities can be persistent." We thanked him, and a sense of relief washed over the crew. The cleansing seemed to have worked, and the rest of the shoot proceeded without incident. However, the memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. Vera's nightmares ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere on set dissipated. We completed the film, and The Conjuring went on to become a huge success. But for those of us who had experienced the haunting firsthand, it was more than just a movie. It was a journey into the supernatural, a brush with forces that defied explanation. Years later, I still think about the shadowy figure and the chilling sense of dread that had pervaded the set. It serves as a reminder of the power of belief and the mysterious forces that exist beyond our understanding. The experience taught me to respect the stories we tell, for they have the power to manifest in ways we can never anticipate. Around midnight, I heard a faint knock on the door of the editing room. Startled, I got up to investigate, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty, the silence oppressive. I closed the door, my heart pounding, and returned to my desk. As I sat down, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. My breath formed visible puffs of air, and a sense of dread settled over me. The computer screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the shadowy figure from Vera's dreams reflected in the monitor. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. I felt a surge of fear, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. Gathering my things, I hurried out of the building, the sense of being watched following me all the way to my car. The next day, I shared my experience with Vera. Her face went pale, and she nodded, as if she had been expecting it. "It's getting stronger," she said. "We need to do something." We decided to speak with James Wan, the director, and the producers. They listened with concern, and it was clear that the strange occurrences were affecting more than just the two of us. James suggested we bring in a spiritual advisor to cleanse the set. We reached out to a local priest, Father Michael, who had experience with exorcisms and spiritual cleansings. He arrived later that afternoon, his presence bringing a sense of calm to the anxious crew. Father Michael moved through the set with quiet determination, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. The atmosphere grew tense as he performed the cleansing, and the air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. We followed him to the various locations where the most unsettling events had occurred, including Vera's trailer and the editing room. As Father Michael entered the editing room, he paused, his face growing serious. "There is a presence here," he said softly, "something malevolent." He continued his prayers, his voice growing stronger as he commanded the spirit to leave. The temperature dropped again, and we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I've been on the road for over 20 years, driving 18-wheelers across the country, from coast to coast. The highway is like a second home to me. You get used to the long hours, the solitude, and the miles of asphalt stretching out in front of you. But every now and then, something happens out there that shakes you to your core, something that makes you question everything you thought you knew. This is one of those stories. It was late November, just before Thanksgiving, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver. The weather had been rough. Early snowstorms had hit the Midwest, turning the roads into icy death traps. I'd been driving through the night, trying to make up for lost time after being delayed by the weather, and I was exhausted. The stretch of highway I was on was particularly desolate, a long, straight road cutting through miles of barren farmland. The snow had stopped, but the cold was biting, and the wind howled across the open fields. There were no other cars on the road, just me and my rig, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Around 3 a.m. I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights, a solitary figure in the freezing night. As I got closer, I could see she was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and wearing a thin coat that was entirely inappropriate for the weather. She looked like she'd been out there for a while. Her face was pale, her lips blue, and she was shivering uncontrollably. Now, I've picked up hitchhikers before, though not often. It's risky, but something about her made me slow down. Maybe it was the look of desperation in her eyes, or maybe it was just the fact that no one should be out in that kind of cold. I pulled over a few yards ahead of her, the brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. I leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Need a ride?" I called out. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. Then she nodded slowly and climbed into the cab. She settled into the seat, clutching her coat tightly around her. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes dark and distant, before she whispered, "Home." "And where's home?" I asked, but she didn't reply. She just stared straight ahead, her hands trembling. I figured she must have been through something rough, maybe a fight with a boyfriend or some kind of trouble that left her out on the road in the middle of nowhere. I didn't press her for details. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the thump of the tires on the asphalt. Every now and then I'd glance over at her, but she never moved, never spoke. It was like she was in a trance, lost in her own thoughts. After about 30 minutes, we came to a small town. It was one of those places that barely qualifies as a town, just a few houses, a gas station, and a diner. I figured it was a good place to stop and maybe get her some food or coffee to warm up. "How about we stop here for a bit?" I suggested. "Get something to eat." She didn't respond, just kept staring out the windshield. I pulled into the parking lot of the diner and turned off the engine. The neon sign in the window flickered, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered ground. I turned to ask her again, but when I looked at the passenger seat, she was gone. The door was still closed, and there was no way she could have just gotten out without me noticing. I was confused, thinking maybe she had somehow slipped out while I wasn't looking, but that didn't make any sense. The cab of a truck isn't that big, and I would have felt the door open or heard something. I got out of the truck and looked around the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. The town was dead quiet, not a soul in sight. The cold wind whipped through the empty streets, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I walked into the diner, hoping maybe she had gone inside. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an old woman behind the register. I asked if anyone had seen a young woman come in, but they all shook their heads. "You sure you didn't just imagine her?" one of the truckers asked with a smirk. I didn't answer. I just walked back out to my truck, my mind racing. I checked the passenger seat again, looking for any sign that she had been there, but there was nothing, no indent in the seat, no stray hairs, nothing. It was like she had never been there at all. I didn't know what to think. I got back into the truck and sat there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. but it felt real, too real to be a dream or a hallucination. I decided to keep driving, get to my destination as fast as possible. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the truck. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye or feel a cold draft, like the door had been opened. But when I looked, there was nothing there. When I finally got to Denver, I was a wreck. I didn't sleep for 2 days, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, pale and frightened, staring at me from the passenger seat. I told a few of my buddies about it, but they all laughed it off, saying it was just the road playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I know she was real. A few weeks later, I was back on that same stretch of highway, driving another load. It was late at night again, and I was half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road, but she wasn't there. Instead, I saw a small roadside memorial cross with some flowers and a photo attached to it. Curious, I pulled over to take a closer look. The photo was old, weathered by the elements, but I could still make out the face. It was her, the girl from the road. The name on the cross was Emily, and the date of death was from over 10 years ago. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Emily had been killed in a car accident on that stretch of road, hit by a drunk driver while she was walking home late at night. I don't know what to believe anymore. Maybe it was her ghost. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I haven't driven that road since. I can't. Every time I think about it, I see her face, hear her voice whispering home, and I know that some things out on the road are better left alone. The night shift at St. Francis Hospital was never easy, but it was a job that paid the bills. I was the night security guard, responsible for keeping the peace in a place that had long since lost its glory. St. Francis had once been a bustling center of medical care, but over the years, as newer, more modern hospitals opened, it had slowly fallen into disrepair. By the time I started working there, only a few wings were still in use. The rest of the hospital left to rot, its corridors dark and silent, filled with the ghosts of the past. When I first took the job, I didn't think much of the stories I heard. The nurses and doctors spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, but I brushed them off as nothing more than urban legends, just the sort of thing people tell each other to pass the time on long, quiet nights. But as the weeks went by, I started to understand that there was something more to those stories. Something real. It was a night like any other. I did my usual rounds, checking the security monitors and walking through the dimly lit hallways of the main wing. The lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else I couldn't quite place, a smell that was faint but unsettling, like the air in a place that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The first strange thing I noticed at night was the elevator. The hospital had 2 elevators, but one of them hadn't worked in years. The old one, the one no one ever used, was supposed to be locked down. But as I walked past it on my way to the stairwell, I heard a faint ding. The sound was so out of place that it stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look, and sure enough, the doors of the old elevator were sliding open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding as I stared into the void. There was no reason for that elevator to be working. It had been out of order for years, the cables rusted, the control panel removed. But there it was, open and waiting, like it was inviting me to step inside. I should have walked away right then and there, but curiosity got the better of me. I shone my flashlight into the elevator, trying to see if there was anything inside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing an interior that was as decayed and forgotten as the rest of the hospital. The walls were lined with cracked tiles, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite make out at first. It was a figure standing in the far corner. Its back to me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could only see the outline of the figure, a dark shape against the dirty walls. It didn't move, didn't react to the light, just stood there, completely still. I called out, asking if someone was there, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, its presence sending a chill down my spine. I was about to turn and leave when the elevator doors started to close. I jumped back, but the doors stopped halfway, jamming with a screech of metal on metal. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart racing. By the time I reached the top, I was out of breath, my mind spinning with questions. Who or what had been in that elevator, and how had it even been operational? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and the shadows were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I continued my rounds, moving through the silent, empty halls. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like you're not alone. As I walked past the old surgical wing, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that would have belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. I turned the corner, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I stood there, listening, waiting for the footsteps to start again, but all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. I kept moving, trying to convince myself that it was just the building settling, the old pipes groaning, or maybe a stray cat that had wandered in. But the sense of unease only grew stronger, gnawing at the back of my mind. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker, thicker, as if they were lived out. My final stop of the night was the morgue. It was a part of the job that I hated the most, but it had to be done. The morgue was located in the basement, down a long, narrow hallway that always seemed colder than the rest of the hospital. The lights flickered as I descended the stairs, casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air down here was different, heavier, almost oppressive. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and pushed the door open. The room was just as I remembered it, rows of stainless steel tables, the air thick with the smell of formaldehyde. But something was different this time. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I walked through the room, my footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. As I reached the far corner, I noticed something strange. One of the drawers, the ones where the bodies were stored, was slightly open, just a crack, but enough to notice. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it. That drawer was supposed to be locked. No one should have been able to open it. Not without a key. I stood in front of the drawer, staring at the small gap, trying to work up the courage to open it fully. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run as fast as I could and never look back. But I couldn't just walk away. I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached out and grabbed the handle, pulling the drawer open. It slid out with a soft whoosh, revealing the white sheet draped over the body inside. I held my breath, half expecting the body to sit up, or for something else to happen, but nothing did. It just lay there, silent and still. I started to close the drawer, but something caught my eye. There was a piece of paper tucked under the edge of the sheet. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled it out. The paper was old, yellowed with age, the edges frayed. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking. It was a photograph, The image was faded, but I could still make out the details. It was a group of people standing in front of what looked like the old surgical wing. They were doctors and nurses, their faces grim and serious, but it was the figure in the background that sent a chill down my spine. It was the same figure I had seen in the elevator, standing in the shadows, its face obscure. My heart raced as I stared at the photo. What was this? Why had it been left here? And what was that figure? I didn't have time to ponder it for long. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. The only sound the rapid thudding of my own heart. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the room around me. But something was wrong. The air felt colder, the shadows deeper. And then I heard it, a soft, raspy breath coming from just behind me. It was an overcast day in late autumn when I first saw the old asylum. I had taken a wrong turn on a back road and ended up in front of a towering structure, its once grand facade now decayed and covered in ivy. The place had always intrigued me, a sort of urban legend in our small town. Rumor had it that the asylum was home to unspeakable horrors, with patients subjected to cruel treatments and left to suffer in the dark corners of its labyrinthine hallways. The official story was that it had been closed decades ago after a series of scandals, but the whispers among the locals told a different story. They spoke of disappearances, strange noises, and eerie sightings that made the place a local ghost story. I'd been curious for years, but I'd never had the courage to explore it until that day. The gate was partially open, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, looking at the heavy clouds rolling in, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked up the path, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The asylum loomed over me, its broken windows like empty eyes staring down. The front doors were ajar, and I pushed them open with a groan of metal. The interior was dark, a stark contrast to the dim light filtering in through the clouds. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam cutting through the thick dust that coated everything. The air was musty, filled with the scent of mold and decay. As I moved through the entrance hall, I noticed the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, revealing the faded grandeur of what once was. There were old, abandoned wheelchairs and rusty metal beds scattered around, a grim reminder of the asylum's past. I wandered through the hallways, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. I reached a large room that looked like it had once been a common area. There were broken chairs and overturned tables, and a large fireplace that was now filled with debris. As I approached, I noticed something odd, a fresh set of footprints in the dust. They led from the entrance to a door on the far side of the room, a door that was partially open. My heart raced as I approached the door, the eerie feeling that I wasn't alone growing stronger. I pushed the door open slowly and found myself in what appeared to be an office. The room was filled with old papers and medical files, all scattered and covered in dust. On one of the desks there was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I picked it up carefully, brushing off the dust. The journal belonged to Dr. Raymond, one of the head doctors at the asylum. Flipping through the pages, I found entries detailing the horrific experiments conducted on the patients. It was clear that Dr. Raymond had been obsessed with finding a cure for mental illness, no matter the cost. The experiments grew more and more inhumane, with patients subjected to painful procedures and left in solitary confinement. As I read, a cold draft swept through the room, and I heard a distant, echoing cry. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The cry sounded like it was coming from deep within the asylum, and it sent chills down my spine. I put the journal back on the desk and decided to investigate the sound. I followed the hallway, the walls seeming to close in around me. The cries grew louder, more desperate. I rounded a corner and saw a staircase leading down into the darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated the blackness below, but I felt a compulsion to descend. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way down, the temperature dropping significantly with each step. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a long corridor lined with heavy metal doors. Many of the doors were open, revealing dark, empty cells. The cries had stopped, leaving only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. I approached one of the cells and noticed something strange scratches on the walls, as if someone had been desperately trying to claw their way out. My heart was pounding as I continued down the corridor, each step feeling heavier. I turned a corner and saw a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The cries started again, louder this time, coming from behind the door. I approached cautiously, the door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single, rusty chair in the center. Strapped to the chair was a tattered cloth, stained and worn. On the wall behind it was a series of markings, numbers, and symbols that made no sense to me, but seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. I backed away from the chair, feeling a wave of nausea. The cries were now accompanied by whispers, as if a crowd of voices were murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I stumbled out of the room and back up the stairs, the feeling of being pursued growing stronger. I burst into the main hall, gasping for breath. The shadows seemed to move and shift around me, and I could feel the presence of unseen eyes watching my every move. I ran for the exit, my flashlight flickering and finally going out. I didn't stop until I was back outside, the cold air hitting my face and the dim light of the overcast sky offering some relief. I didn't look back as I raced to my car, the oppressive feeling of the asylum lifting only when I was safely behind the wheel. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling of being followed. The cries and whispers from the asylum haunt my dreams, and I can't help but feel that something was awakened that night, something that was meant to stay hidden in the shadows of that forsaken building.